What is up, guys? Welcome to my review for The Flash, Season 6, Episode 2, titled A Flash of the Lightning. This episode is titled after the 8th issue of Crisis on Infinite Earths, something you probably already knew, but for the people who didn't, then that is the case, and in that issue, Barry Allen died, which is something we see in this episode, which is by far the best part of the episode, and I'll get to that in this review, but saying that it's the best part of the episode doesn't really mean much. I mean, it is a great moment, but the rest of the episode I thought was kind of disappointing. Aside from the introduction of Joan Williams and Barry Allen actually seeing the future, this episode is fairly filler, and it doesn't really add much to the plot of the storyline or even to Crisis on Infinite Earths, again, aside from Barry actually seeing the future. That being said, this episode is still pretty damn good, except for like a couple parts. So in this review, I'll go over the Crisis on Infinite Earths stuff first, like I do with every review for the Arrowverse this season, even though this episode, a whole storyline is about Crisis, which is Barry Allen's, so I'll go over that first, then the Killer Frost storyline, then Cecile's storyline, and then the climax with everything coming together. With that in mind, let's begin with the Crisis on Infinite Earths / Barry Allen storyline. So this storyline with Barry is certainly, like, by far the best and only, I think, great part of this episode. As in the last episode, the Monitor revealed to Barry that he will have to die to save the multiverse in the future during the crisis, and this episode is all about Barry dealing with that, and I think Grant Gustin did a great job at handling the acting of Barry, dealing with the fact that he knows he's gonna die, something that Stephen Amell obviously has to do as well in this season, but Barry actually creates a portable Gideon, which I really like how they handle that. I really think that if going forward, Gideon is the main person that Barry talks to when he's out on the field and not people in Star Labs. That I think is way better, because at this point it seems like that Cisco will go back to being Vibe. The only people at Star Labs would either be like Joe or Iris, which I don't think works. So if it's Gideon that he talks to usually, then I am all for that, because in this episode we see that later during the climax when he fights Ultraviolet, he talks to Gideon, who helps him out after he falls, which I think is great, and I think it's a lot better than him talking to somebody in Star Labs. But anyway, he creates this portable Gideon. He tries to run to the future to see the world or even the universe or the multiverse after he dies. But he's hit by this antimatter wall. The antimatter, I'm pretty sure, has never been mentioned in the Arrowverse before, so this is really cool, a really cool introduction to that aspect of the crisis, as the antimatter comes from the antimatter universe and is probably from the Anti-Monitor, the main villain of the original comic book, and also the upcoming crossover, so that I think is a great element of the crisis that they introduced. I'm pretty sure they introduced in this episode, but then because he's hurt by the antimatter, Gideon, in his ear, tells him that there's an expert on the subject, so he goes to Earth 3 to meet up with Jay. Now, Jay's return in this episode was something that I was excited for. I was a little let down because he never suited up as the Flash, and I doubt he's ever going to do that in the future, as he's walking around with a cane and his speed is depleting, and I doubt he's ever going to actually suit up considering he's retired. However, it is still always cool to see him, especially with his where we see him here with his multiverse map. This is really cool. It doesn't show every universe, but the ones we see, like specifically Earth 38, next to it says Superman and Supergirl, and then Earth 221 it says Sherlock Wells. There are a couple Earths I can't really decipher what they say, but this is, I think, a really interesting multiverse map. But then Jay introduces his wife Joan to Barry. Joan is a counterpart or doppelganger of Nora Allen, which is something that we already knew was going to happen, but that doesn't take away from the fact that these scenes were slightly emotional, with Barry reuniting with his mother, which is basically the exact same thing that happens in the episode of Arrow this week, where he reunites with his mother of another universe. So that, I think, was an interesting parallel, but these scenes, I think, were slightly emotional because of this reunion with Barry seeing his mother again. But then, I guess my theory was true that this machine where he wears Jay Garrick's helmet is what allows him to see the future and not him going to the future. So that was like my original thought, and that happened to be the case. But this is when we get to the Doctor Strange element of it all, as Barry sees billions, this time billions, while Doctor Strange saw like a couple million. Barry sees literally billions, considering he's a speedster. He's able to process it all, but in all these possible futures, the multiverse always dies. Similarly to Doctor Strange, it's only one universe. This time we already know how it happens. Barry sacrifices himself to save the multiverse, where the multiverse, or at least the universe, survives. Now, I think that this scene where Barry actually sees himself running through the Speed Force with his new costume and then disintegrating is one of the coolest looking scenes on this show. Not only does his suit, I think, look amazing in this scene, I'm really getting used to this suit so much more than I thought I would, and it's possible that I will end up liking it just as much as the Season 4 suit, because in scenes like this one, it looks amazing, and the recreation of of the original scene in the comic where he dies, he's not on this machine, the machine that's destroying the multiverse, and he is running through the Speed Force. But honestly, that might be for the better, because the background with the Speed Force, visually, it looks really cool. So that was a great moment, by far the greatest moment of this episode, and definitely elevated this episode quite a lot. One other thing we see during all these flashbacks, or flash forwards really, or these visions, is that Cisco has returned to being Vibe in at least one of the possible futures, which is almost definitely something that's going to happen, and I'm glad it is, because I think Cisco getting rid of his powers, especially where with the crisis coming up just in the future, not very far in the future, it was kind of stupid, so I'm glad he's getting his powers back. The question is, how and when is he going to do that? And I'm guessing it's whenever Breacher returns. So after he does that, Barry telling Jay and Joan about the possible futures that he sees, and then later telling all the other people, Grant Gustin's acting is so good. Like I said, knowing that he has to die, and that he will die, he does such a great job at that, and that's also definitely one of the better parts of this episode, not to mention the speech that after Barry returns to Earth 1, along with Jay and Joan, Joe gives Barry a speech about needing or having the will to sacrifice for themselves for the greater good, where their badges or emblems give them the power to do so. I thought that was a great speech. And a great Joe moment, which is something that has been lacking. I mean, the second half of Season 5 had a couple of them, but certainly in the beginning of Season 5, since Joe barely appeared, it was very much lacking, but those scenes are always really, really good. So all in all, the Flash/Crisis storyline was by far the best part of this episode, and it's not even close, as moments like Barry running through the Speed Force in the future as he sees, as well as all the other moments of Grant Gustin realizing, or Grant Gustin playing the fact that he, or the character Barry Allen, needs to die and now knows that he's going to, and even Barry creating a portable Gideon. It's all definitely really cool, and by far the best part of this episode. However, while that storyline was good, the rest of the episode I don't think was. Killer Frost storyline, Cecile storyline, and even Bloodworks storyline wasn't exactly something that I enjoyed. Specifically, I think the worst part of this episode was everything to do with Killer Frost. I thought maybe that it could be interesting for Killer Frost to take over as the main character as Caitlin takes the back seat, but honestly, I kind of miss Caitlin in this episode, and this whole storyline with Killer Frost learning how to be a regular person, I absolutely hated it. Maybe not hated it completely, but I really, really did not enjoy it, as Cisco Ralph and Killer Frost as a regular person, where her voice and eyes are no longer changed, go to this art show with Killer Frost being very rude to the artist and Camilla, and throughout this episode she draws something, learns how to not be rude, and then also put some art up on Star Labs. I think it's not funny, it's really stupid, and I also, like I said, missed Caitlin in this episode, as I felt like she was not around, which was the case. So all in all, I think that part of the episode is not something I like, and I don't know if Killer Frost taking over instead of Caitlin is something that will end up being a good thing for this season or this show. Similarly, Cecile's storyline I don't think was great. It has a couple problems, namely it focuses on Cecile, which is never a good thing, but also it's kind of a villain of the week storyline, except for Cecile deciding that she wants to be a metahuman defense attorney, which did not need an entire storyline for her to decide that. It is very much just a villain of the week storyline, and that is it. Not to mention, like I said, Cecile being focused on never works out in the slightest. That was always the case in Season 5, and so far with this one episode, it is the case in this season, as Cecile does not deserve her own storylines whatsoever, and she's a pretty bad character when she's focused on in this show. So overall, the storyline was, I think, the worst part, or maybe equal with Killer Frost as being the worst parts of this episode. However, the ending, the climax between the fight between Ultraviolet and the Flash was pretty good. Not amazing. I don't think that it was an amazing or intense fight, but it was, I think, visually pretty good, and Flash's suit, which I'm really warming up to so much more than I expected to, looks pretty awesome in this scene as well. So overall, a pretty good climax to the episode, a good Barry Allen storyline, a pretty bad Killer Frost and Cecile storyline, but overall not a bad episode at all. Something I didn't mention yet was everything to do with the blood work, as in the beginning of the episode he kills somebody, and in the end of the episode he experiments on the same person he killed, which leads to him coming back, which is something that they're going to focus on in the next episode. So far, the blood work stuff in this episode is kind of like, it's right at the beginning, right at the end, and it's just there for setup, which I'm definitely interested in seeing Bloodwork as the villain of this show, but for now, it's just setup, and it's a little bit boring for what they're doing. I am a fan of them actually showing the origin story before he becomes a villain, but in this specific episode, not really much or enough was shown to be an interesting storyline. Not terrible, again, but also not exactly great. So in conclusion, this episode I thought was not as good as I expected it to be, as the storyline with the Flash and the Crisis setup was pretty awesome, but the Killer Frost storyline was pretty bad, Cecile's storyline was not very good, and the Bloodworks scenes were not exactly good enough to elevate this episode. It's really just the Flash storyline along with the climax of the episode that makes it actually pretty good, and it definitely gets me fairly excited for the Crisis. Not that I needed to be more excited, but I really do like the build up to the Crisis in these episodes. So overall, I don't think this episode is as good as episode 1, but it is still a fairly good episode, and I'll give it an 8.5 out of 10. Let me know what you thought about the episode in the comments down below, and stay tuned for my review of Arrow Season 8, Episode 1, which is coming out in probably just a couple hours after this one, and it's an episode that I really enjoyed, so stay tuned for that review, and as always, thanks for watching.